in Prime Time. I'm Tamanna Namdar.
And my name is Ayush Shalavadi. Let's have a look at today's headlines. The RBI goes into damage control mode after the PNB fraud discontinues letters of undertaking and letters of comfort as trade credits for imports into India.
The Supreme Court extends deadlines for linking Aadhaar to bank accounts, mobile phones and other services till a judgment is pronounced in the matter.
The Supreme Court rules that foreign law firms cannot practice in India, but they are allowed to fly in and fly out to provide legal advice to their clients on matters pertaining to foreign laws.
Tata Sons raises $1.38 billion by selling stake in TCS via block deals.
Indian equity benchmark ended lower for a sixth time in 8 trading sessions this month. TCS, Kotak Mahindra Bank and Infosys face selling pressure.
Another day and another high-profile exit from the Trump administration. The U.S. president fires Rex Tillerson and names CIA's Pompeo as Secretary of State. Well, let's begin with the top story this evening. Straight on to the major RBI decision. In the wake of the PNB fraud case, the RBI has banned banks from issuing letters of undertaking and letters of comfort. In a notification, the RBI also said that the decision comes into force with immediate effect. Vishwanath Nair joins us now with more details on this. Vishwanath, take us through what this means and what its impact could be.
So, Tamanna, what has happened essentially is that letters of undertaking and letters of comfort were two products which were largely used by Indian banks to be issued to the foreign branches of other Indian banks so that their customers could get some form of trade credit. Now, the RBI, while it has not really tried to ban it in the past, now has seen the recent Nirav Modi fraud event and has gone ahead and asked banks to stop issuing these certificates. What the banks can do instead for trade credit is issue letters of credit and bank guarantees, which is what most international banks do out there for trade credit. Domestic banks are allowed to do this so that they can get credit for their customers. But LOUs are, remember what happened with the Nirav Modi case was that associates of Nirav Modi got in touch with the Punjab National Bank's employees and issued fraudulent LOUs. Which were then identified and which were approved by the foreign branches of other Indian banks, and thereby money was removed without actually any due process being followed. So to avoid any such situation, this is all part of a number of steps that the Reserve Bank has been taking in this specific case. Only yesterday, the Reserve Bank of India had put out a notification on its website which said that letters of credit cannot exceed 1 year unless there are some special circumstances. So it is doing a lot of these measures to try and curb any potential frauds that may develop in the coming years.
All right, stay on with us, Vishwanath Nair. Former Banking Secretary Dinesh Kumar Mittal and V.G. Kannan, who's CEO of Indian Banks Association, also joins us on the phone line for more on this story, even as it's developing. Let me start with you, Mr. Kannan. Can you take us through the details of what this means? What's the extent of business this will impact? And what are the options now for importers in terms of credit?
Let me actually go through the entire process. Yes. Normal scenario would be a person opens a letter of credit for a short period and subsequently takes a buyer's credit by asking his banker to issue a LOU, and whereby the foreign bank, the funding bank, makes a payment to the issuing bank, who in turn makes payment to the original supplier. So this is the process which has been normally followed. And these are all instances where the suppliers normally do not give credit for more than 3 days or 5 days or 10 days. And indirectly, the buyer is in a position to enjoy a credit for almost a year by going through the LOU facility. What the Reserve Bank of India circular actually says is, instead of going through this road, you straight away go in for a letter of credit for a period of 8 months or 9 months or 1 year, and let the supplier himself provide the credit. in case the supplier wants the money, he should discount the bills with his own banker, wherever he is, and take the money after paying after getting the present value of the bill. So this is the process which will follow. So there won't be any change as regards the requirement of the funding limits. However, in the event the supplier refuses to give a credit for 1 year, the domestic buyer has to arrange for rupee funds or foreign currency funds in case he has got dollars or foreign currency and make payment on the due date. So this will, in effect, end up having more funded facilities made available to the domestic player.
Right, Mr. Khanna, I want to pose that question to Mr. Mittal as well. Mr. Mittal, especially the importers who, until now, hitherto actually, relied on these LOUs or letters of comfort. The system that Vishwanath was explaining earlier, and when we're talking about letters of credit, how will this work differently and how will this impact those sort of businesses?
Yeah, you see, Mr. Khanna explained rightly that guarantees are available and they were always available. Question would be if a Bank of India has a branch, say, in Singapore, need to issue a guarantee or do I issue to LOU or LOC? So that was the way. But let me go back to the basic issue. There was nothing wrong with LOU and LOC. What was wrong was the way they were issued. And the same thing could also happen with guarantees. So there is no safety mechanism available to say that a fraud cannot happen with guarantees. There are so many frauds which have happened with guarantees also. So I think the basic issue was the way these LOUs were issued, LOCs were issued, and that issue still remains intact. But I think for the sake of bringing uniformity of the Indian financial system with the global standards, I think the RBI has done away with. So it won't impact much, but it would impact to some of the smaller fellows, right? Those who have smaller demands and smaller requirements, I think they will be hard-pressed to move to new system and to get the guarantees issued and then make the payment to the overseas supplier.
In fact, I want to ask Mr. Kannan about it. And in your first response, Mr. Kannan, you explained how the suppliers will have to give credit to importers for a year. And if they don't agree, the importers will have to arrange their own cash to make up for it and pay on due date. How will this impact the competitiveness of Indian companies who would be depending on these imports for their business? Why would these suppliers extend credit to these specific Indian companies? And if they had those amounts of funds available in the first place, they probably would not be using instruments like LOUs. So will this have a far-reaching impact on these traders, especially smaller ones?
Yes, as Mr. Mittal also mentioned, it will have small impact. Technically speaking, the process of getting the credit is same. Earlier, it used to be the banker which is providing what is called the buyer's credit, the credit given to the buyer. In the normal LC, it is the supplier who is giving the credit. It's part of the documentation. So the bills will be a usance bill, and he will extend credit. And normally this happens in many cases where the overseas supplier finds that there's a lot of competition, and to get the benefit of the business quickly, they extend a 1 year credit. And he in turn, in case he wants money, he can go and discount it with the bank. So now, in case he is insisting that he will only supply on demand, then the domestic buyer has to make arrangement for funds to make good the payment on the due date. So yes, the domestic person will be affected in as much as to pay the domestic rupee funding, or if he is having regular exports, he can use the exports to make payment. So, but all the same, his funded facility will get blocked.
Right, Mr. Kannan, this is Vishwanath joining in for a question. Basically, this is something that Mr. Khan had said in the past, in past discussions with us. He had pointed out that some international agencies had had raised a question about the LOUs and LOCs and stated that they were not exactly comfortable. And at that point in time, the RBI had decided not to discontinue these products and go on allowing banks to issue these letters. Do you think that probably at that point in time it was maybe a wrong decision, because it seems it is ripe for misuse.
See, regarding the misuse, as Mr. Mittal rightly mentioned, the LOU was a good product, which was basically an indigenous product which was made available for people who, Indians. This was basically, if you remember, started sometime in the 90s after the problems we faced, where LOU was a means of postponing the payment by the domestic buyer to encourage him to take credit and also subsequently make payment in due course, thereby conserving foreign exchange. And this suited both the buyer as also the banks. And the supplier was getting his money on due date, so it didn't affect anyone. I basically feel that there's a system issue in this particular case of the PNB. And the reasons are, yes, LOU could be misused. And then the same way, I think even the bank guarantee could be misused. The bank guarantee can also be issued without entering the system. I think LOU also could be done. And therefore, I don't think that is actually the final solution. But yes, some of the domestic players could be affected.
Mr. Mittal, I just want to come back to the point you were making and expand on that, because that's a very important point that you made, that LOUs is one kind of instrument which was misused in the PNB case. There is nothing to say that the current systems will not be misused. Guarantees have also been misused. Is this a bit like, bolting the stable doors after the horse is left? And what else needs to be done?
The issue remains that internal control mechanisms need to improve. The systems need to be put in place and they need to be monitored. So it ultimately boils down to governance of the boards and the respective committees, the competence of the board members. So those issues which were raised in February 2015, they still remain intact and they need to be addressed properly. Unless they are addressed, these kind of issues will keep on coming. That's very unfortunate, but let me say at this forum that public sector banks have a very important role to play in our economy. And those who speak regularly on privatization, I think they are not seen India 50 years back or 40 years back. So India is one of the best countries in developing world which has the best penetration of banking. So it is only because of public sector banks and not because of private sector banks. While the private sector banks have brought different values, we agree with that. But it does not mean that public sector banks need to close down. The solution will lie by improving their efficiency, by their governance, by their human resource capabilities. I think the solution will lie there. Ownership does not decide what kind of governance should be there. You can have the best companies in public sector and you can have the worst companies in private sector. So I do not think really to link it that way, that public sector banks are bad, and then you always read some article somewhere which is half-baked. That's very unfair to say that from one case. But the issue remains. That issue remains that the governance needs to improve dramatically. That's the fact.
Fair point, Mr. Mittal. Thanks so much for speaking to us on Bloomberg Quint. Mr. Kannan, thanks so much for joining us as well. Now, of course, that is a story which we'll continue getting new updates on Bloomberg Quint. Now, moving on, the Supreme Court has extended the March 31st deadline to link Aadhaar with other services. The extension will be in place till the Constitutional Bench delivers its verdict on Aadhaar. This comes at a time when mobile service providers and banks are pushing users to link their Aadhaar with mobile numbers, PAN cards and bank accounts. Arpan Chaturvedi joins us now. Arpan, what are the implications of this interim order, and will this end the ongoing push for Aadhaar linkage?
Well, the deadline for Aadhaar linkages was March 31st, and during the hearing, the petitioner had asked the court repeatedly that it should once again clarify that this deadline will be extended until the hearing is completed. And today, of course, the Supreme Court has passed an order where they have said that all the linking deadlines of Aadhaar with the phone, mobile numbers, bank accounts, all of them stand extended indefinitely, which means basically till the time the hearing is completed and the judgment is pronounced. There is one exception, of course, which is that all the benefits, services and subsidies which are governed by Section 7, which is basically your social services provided by the government, it will not apply to that particular aspect. Apart from that, all the other extensions or the deadline, linking deadlines stand extended by today's order of the Supreme Court.
Thanks for that, Arpan. Pranesh Prakash joins us now for more on the story. He's Policy Director for the Center on Internet and Society. Thanks so much, Pranesh, for speaking with us. Is it a big sigh of relief for those who were waiting for this Supreme Court judgment and looking at the fact that 31st March is upon us? What do we do next? So some relief for now?
Not really, for three specific reasons. One, this exception, this carve-out that was mentioned under Section 7, it's not very clear because the government itself has argued that under Section 7, Aadhaar is not necessarily mandatory and that those who do not have Aadhaar numbers can use other means as well for proving their identity. So it's not clear whether it's mandatory or not, and this order causes more confusion rather than providing clarity. And second reason is that code is law. So regardless of what the Supreme Court does in terms of extension of deadline, if the software systems being used by various private entities and by the government make Aadhaar number mandatory and make Aadhaar authentication mandatory, and if that doesn't change to making it optional, because changing all these software systems might take time and effort, if that doesn't happen quickly, then none of this matters. The court might order something in terms of law, but in terms of practice, something else will prevail. And thirdly, what the court has ordered is only in terms of what the government has mandated. Now, there are very many services, including, for instance, if you apply for a credit card from whether it's a private bank or a nationalized bank, you will be required to provide Aadhaar number because their software systems need it. Now, this is not mandated by the government. This is just a requirement that the banks have imposed. Now, in this kind of a situation, there's no relief being provided by the court. And it's also questionable whether any other instance, including instances where people have died for lack of food grain because they haven't been able to authenticate themselves using Aadhaar, whether this kind of an order would help any of them. So all in all, this order, while it is welcome, is hardly sufficient and hardly provides any clarity and doesn't really do much in terms of good.
All right, Pranesh, thanks so much for speaking to us on Primetime. Now, moving on to the next story, ICICI Securities has filed a revised draft red herring prospectus or a DRHP with the Registrar of Companies just a week before the IPO hits the primary market. People in the know have told Bloomberg Quint that ICICI's broking and merchant banking arm is looking to lower its valuations substantially. Sajid Mangat, who's been tracking this development, joins us now with the details. Sajid, by how much have they really cut the valuations by, and what's the reason for them to do so?
Well, ICICI Securities, is all set to come to the market as early as next week. We understand from our sources that the securities and merchant banking arm of ICICI Bank has filed the updated draft red herring prospectus with SEBI on Tuesday, and in the next 2 days it is expected to file the red herring prospectus with the Registrar of Companies. The company is in the process of coming out with its maiden IPO, which will primarily be offer for sale by ICICI Bank of up to 22% stake, and that would mean that the ICICI Bank would be raising close to 4,000 crores as part of the IPO process. Now, the interesting thing is that when ICICI Securities filed its draft red herring prospectus last year, it sought a valuation of nearly 25,000 crores. Now, that has come down drastically, and now the total valuation is coming to nearly 18,000 crores, and that's primarily because of market conditions and the fall in market that has happened in the last 2 to 3 months, where markets have fallen substantially, and that has hampered valuation of many of the companies which are coming out with IPO or will be coming out with IPO in the next month or so. We wrote to ICICI Bank and ICICI Securities seeking clarification, but we didn't get any response. But we understand that there's a roadshow which is expected expected as early as by the end of this week, and the IPO is expected to open next week, and the entire process of IPO is expected to be completed by the end of this fiscal, which is March 31st.
All right, thanks so much for that, Sajid. Now, foreign law firms can't set up shop in India. The Supreme Court today ruled that a foreign legal firm can only advise on foreign law, that too on a fly-in, fly-out basis. Shivani Saxena now tells us what this order means for foreign law firms and lawyers.
Many stakeholders had different expectations from the Supreme Court for its judgment on the entry of foreign law firms in India. But whether restricted by the legal framework or not, the Supreme Court ruled in the favor of continued ban on foreign players to practice law in India. Upholding the prior 2009 Bombay High Court and the 2012 Madras High Court judgments, the Supreme Court held today that foreign law firms cannot set up offices in India or practice law, whether in the Indian courts or commercial deals. The Advocates Act, which deals with the practice of law, only allows a person who is a citizen of India and has a degree in law from a recognized university within the territory of India to practice law in the country. But the court did grant partial relief to foreign lawyers and law firms. The Apex Court clarified that there is no bar for them to visit India for a temporary period on a fly-in and fly-out basis. But the purpose of such visits can only be limited for giving legal advice on foreign law issues or on their own system of law or even on diverse international legal issues. At the same time, the government or the regulator, which in this case is the Bar Council of India, may make rules and regulations in relation to this practice. Another relaxation offered by the Supreme Court relates to arbitration in India. In order to popularize it, the court said that the foreign law firms and lawyers may come into India to conduct international commercial arbitration, provided that these rules of arbitral institutions permit this. The last clarification was in favor of liaison offices or BPOs set up in India to provide ancillary services linked to the legal practices like secretarial support or transcription services. These services cannot be considered to be practice of law in India, and the Advocates Act and the Bar Council of India rules does not exactly govern it, and therefore this leeway is provided. Now, the practice in other countries like USA and UK do permit practice of law by offshore or foreign lawyers, and some stakeholders have urged the government to consider reciprocating the norms. It will be interesting to see if any new rules are implemented or the existing laws amended to welcome these demands.
All right, very interesting development from the legal sector. Now, moving on to markets. Indian equity benchmarks ended lower for a sixth time in 8 trading sessions this month. The Sensex closed marginally lower, while the Nifty ended flat. Now, Vice Chairman of the Niti Aayog, Rajiv Kumar, says the government will come up with a mobility policy before the end of 2019. Speaking at the Gateway of India Geo-Economic Dialogues 2018, Rajiv Kumar today said that Niti Aayog is coordinating with other ministries to put a mobility policy in place. He also said that the government is serious about developing charging infrastructure to accelerate its EV push.
We are at it in the sense that we will have a mobility policy fairly within this year. Niti Aayog is coordinating with several ministries on this. There is significant steps have been taken both on the charging infrastructure, on the production of EVs, on the fiscal subsidies that could be in place. So we are serious about it, and we see this as an area where we could leapfrog into the front ranks of the global order.
Now, as talk of a united opposition does the rounds, UPA chairperson Sonia Gandhi has invited leaders of 17 opposition parties for dinner at her residence today. The guest list includes Sudeep Bandopadhyay of the TMC, Kanimoni from the DMK, Ram Gopal Yadav from the Samajwadi Party, and Sitaram Yechuri and D. Raja from the left parties. Those excluded from the meet include the leaders of TRS, the BJD and the TDP. Sonia Gandhi has called for opposition unity, saying parties should set aside their differences to get together in the larger interest of keeping the BJP out of power in the 2019 Lok Sabha elections. And one of the issues possibly that makes it to the agenda of this opposition meet is the Rajya Sabha elections. That is poised to be the next big battleground between the BJP and the Congress and other opposition parties. We're going to be talking more about that on Primetime Debate. We'll be joined by BJP spokesperson Narendra Taneja, Congress spokesperson Gaurav Vallabh, and Business Standard's political editor Aditi Phadnis. So do tune in for that chat.
All right, moving on to top international news. The US President Donald Trump has sacked Rex Tillerson as Secretary of State. Director of CIA Mike Pompeo will replace Rex Tillerson, and Gina Haspel will in turn become the new director of the CIA. Haspel will also be the first woman director of the agency. Here are the reasons that Trump listed for sacking Tillerson.
Rex and I have been talking about this for a long time. We got along actually quite well, but we disagreed on things. When you look at the Iran deal, I think it's terrible. I guess he thought it was okay. I wanted to either break it or do something, and he felt a little bit differently. So we were not really thinking the same. I made the North Korea decision with consultation from many people, but I made that decision by myself.
Meanwhile, global CNBC personality Larry Kudlow has emerged as President Donald Trump's favorite to replace the outgoing director of the White House Economic Council, Gary Cohn. Larry Kudlow is already one of the informal advisors to President Trump. He's also a radio host, syndicated columnist, and an entrepreneur, and was previously an economist for Bear Stearns. He also served in former President Ronald Reagan's administration. All right, Tamanna, it's been an action-packed week already, Monday and Tuesday.
Yes.
And, well, Primetime Debate was a special one yesterday, as was Primetime. What about Primetime Debate today?
So today, of course, as we mentioned a little while earlier, we're going to talk about the Rajya Sabha elections and how that's turning out to be a big fight between the BJP and the Congress, especially in the states of Gujarat and Uttar Pradesh, where the BJP has fielded extra candidates so that the Congress really has to work hard to get those seats. But there's also an interesting conversation that you can catch today on Primetime Debate. I've caught up with Sunil Deodhar. He is the BJP's Tripura in charge and the man who is credited with being the architect of that huge win for the BJP in a state controlled by the left for several decades. Do tune into that chat coming up ahead on Primetime Debate as well. We're coming right back.
Where there